Number 1. The Whispering Villa. Anna and her family were thrilled to escape the chaos of city life for a peaceful vacation in the Italian countryside. They had rented a beautiful old villa nestled in the hills, surrounded by ancient olive groves and picturesque landscapes. The villa, with its ivy-covered stone walls and wrought iron gates, seemed like the perfect retreat. However, from the moment they arrived, Anna felt uneasy. The air was thick with a strange stillness, as if the villa held its breath. The locals they met in the nearby village seemed kind but distant. When Anna mentioned where they were staying, their smiles faded, replaced by nervous glances. One old woman even grabbed Anna's hand and whispered, "Be careful. The house remembers." That first night, Anna lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside. But beneath the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves, there was something else, a faint, whispering voice. She strained to hear, but it was too soft to understand. Anna dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on her and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Anna found her daughter, Emily, playing near a dusty old mirror in one of the villa's unused rooms. "Mommy, there's a lady in the mirror," Emily said, pointing to her reflection. Anna's heart skipped a beat. "Don't be silly," she replied, but as she looked into the mirror, she could have sworn she saw something move behind her, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Over the next few days, the whispering grew louder. Anna heard it everywhere in the hallways, the garden, even in the kitchen. It was as if the villa itself was speaking to her. One night, she followed the sound to the attic, a place she had not yet explored. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and old, forgotten belongings. In the center of the attic was a large, ornate trunk. The whispers were louder now, urging her to open it. With trembling hands, Anna unlatched the trunk. Inside, she found old letters, photographs, and a small, delicate locket. As she touched the locket, a chill ran down her spine. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single, clear voice, a woman's voice saying, "You must leave." Anna recoiled in terror, dropping the locket as she fled the attic. The voice was no longer whispering, it was screaming in her mind, warning her to get out. She grabbed Emily and ran to her husband, urging him to leave the villa immediately. At first, he resisted, but when he saw the fear in Anna's eyes, he didn't argue. They left the villa that night, never looking back. As they drove away, Anna glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the shadowy figure of a woman standing in the villa's doorway, watching them leave. The villa had let them go, but not without leaving its mark on their memories forever. Number 2. The Shadow on the Wall. Lena had always been a night owl, often staying up late reading or working on her art. Her apartment, located on the top floor of an old building, was quiet and cozy, with large windows that let in the soft glow of the moon. It was her sanctuary, a place where she felt at peace until the night the shadow appeared. It was just after midnight when Lena noticed it. She had been sketching at her desk when a movement caught her eye. She looked up and saw a shadow on the far wall, long and thin, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree branch swaying outside. But when she checked the window, there was nothing that could cast such a shadow. The shadow didn't move, but something about it felt wrong. It was too dark, too defined, as if it had substance. Lena tried to shake off the feeling of unease, convincing herself that it was just her imagination. But as the night wore on, the shadow seemed to grow darker and more pronounced. Lena decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would chase away her irrational fears. But as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadow lingered in her mind, and despite her exhaustion, sleep wouldn't come. In the early hours of the morning, Lena was jolted awake by a loud thump. She sat up, her heart pounding, and looked around her bedroom. The shadow was there on the wall opposite her bed, only now it was different. It had shifted in shape, becoming more human-like. It was as if someone was standing in her room, their outline perfectly captured in shadow on the wall. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the shadow began to move. It slid across the wall, inching closer to her bed. Paralyzed with fear, she watched as it stretched toward her, its form becoming more solid with each passing second. Lena wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. Just as the shadow was about to reach her, the sun began to rise, its first light filtering through the window. The shadow recoiled, retreating into the corner of the room, where it disappeared completely. Lena was left shaking, drenched in cold sweat as the morning light filled the room. She didn't sleep for the next few nights, terrified that the shadow would return. She left every light on, refusing to let darkness fall in her apartment. But as the days passed, the exhaustion became too much, and one night she finally succumbed to sleep. That was the last time anyone saw Lena. Her friends and family reported her missing after days of no contact. When the police entered her apartment, they found it empty, except for one thing: a dark, human-shaped shadow on the wall, stretching from the floor to the ceiling. The shadow didn't move, but it felt alive, as if it were watching anyone who dared to come near. No one could explain where Lena had gone or how the shadow had formed. The apartment was eventually rented out again, but tenants never stayed long. They all reported the same thing: a feeling of being watched, and a shadow on the wall that seemed to grow darker each night. Number 3. The Midnight Train. Martin had always been fascinated by trains, especially the old-fashioned steam locomotives. When he heard about the abandoned railway station just outside of town, he couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The station had been out of use for decades, closed down after a mysterious accident in the late 1940s. Local legends spoke of a ghost train that haunted the tracks, appearing only at midnight on foggy nights. Most dismissed it as just a story, but Martin was intrigued. One Friday night, armed with only a flashlight and his camera, Martin set out for the station. The fog was thick, rolling in like waves, shrouding everything in an eerie silence. As he approached the crumbling platform, the air grew colder, and the once distant sounds of the night faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The station was in ruins with broken windows and overgrown tracks. Martin wandered along the platform, snapping pictures, his breath visible in the cold night air. Midnight was approaching, and despite his skepticism, he found himself glancing nervously at his watch. At exactly midnight, the silence was broken by the distant sound of a train whistle. Martin's heart raced as he turned toward the tracks. Emerging from the fog, he saw a massive black steam locomotive, its headlights piercing through the mist. The train rolled slowly into the station, its brakes screeching as it came to a halt. But something was wrong. The train was ancient, its metal rusted, and its windows dark. No one disembarked. The doors remained closed, and the station was eerily still. Martin's curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously approached the train. As he reached out to touch the cold metal of the door, it suddenly slid open with a loud creak. Inside, the train was pitch black, but Martin could make out the faint outlines of the seats. He stepped inside, his flashlight flickering. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something rotten. As he moved down the aisle, the train lurched forward, the door slamming shut behind him. Martin tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the train began to pick up speed. Desperately, Martin made his way through the carriages, but each one was the same: dark, empty, and filled with a growing sense of dread. In the last carriage, he found something that made his blood run cold. There, in one of the seats, was a man, or at least what was left of him. His skin was pale, stretched over his bones, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead. It was clear he had been dead for decades. Martin stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. As he turned to flee, he noticed more figures in the shadows, all staring at him with hollow eyes. The train's passengers, long dead, had come to claim him. The train picked up speed, hurtling through the night, its whistle screaming like a banshee. Martin ran through the carriages, desperately trying to find a way out, but there was no escape. The ghostly passengers reached out for him, their icy hands brushing against his skin. With a final, terrifying scream, the train plunged into a tunnel, the darkness swallowing everything. The next morning, the train station was as silent and abandoned as it had been for decades. The fog had lifted and the sun was shining, but there was no sign of Martin. His camera was found on the platform, its last photo capturing the faint outline of a black train emerging from the fog. Martin was never seen again, and the legend of the midnight train continued to haunt the town for generations.